Last Monday, November 16th, the Trade Union Congress of Great Britain held its conference on the economy entitled Beyond Crisis. The conference was about developing a progressive answer to the challenges faced by the financial meltdown and the consequent recession. The keynote speaker to this conference was none other than the eminent theologian Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It is a sign of the times that in secular Britain, the TUC had invited the head of the Anglican Church to address it on economics. I can assure you that we had no information when we decided the topic of this year's Gaudium et Spes lecture. In modesty, I think it's harder in this CERN's cap to have read the same reading, to have had the same reading of the Signs of the Times. Archbishop Williams entitled his speech, Human Well-Being and Economic Decision-Making, a title which reminds me of a book written more than 30 years ago by Schumacher with the title, Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. Archbishop Williams argued that economics understood in abstraction is not just an academic error, but it dismantles the walls of the oikos. Appealing, and I'm quoting, to the market as an independent authority unconnected with human decisions about housekeeping has meant in many contexts over the last few decades a ruinous legacy for heavily indebted countries, large-scale and costly social disruption even in developed economies, and most recently, the extraordinary phenomena of financial trading world in which the marketing of toxic debt had become the driver of money-making, although the bluffs were all called that at the same time. The system will go on unless you are ready to question and resist the often taken for granted assumptions. The energy for resistance, Williams tells us, has to come from the sort of stubborn moral and cultural commitment to humane virtue. This cannot but bring to mind the speech of Mr. Gordon Brown at St. Paul's Cathedral at the end of last March, and I quote, "And I want to suggest to all of you here today that this most modern of crises, the first financial crisis of the global age, has confirmed the enduring importance of the most timeless of truths, that our financial system must be founded on the very same values that are at the heart of the best of our family lives." I wouldn't like to take much of your time, but however, I would ask you to allow me to give you yet another quote from Archbishop Williams' speech to the TUC. Open quote. "I realize that the word virtue is hard for many to take seriously, but it is high time that we reclaimed it. We have no other way of talking about the solid qualities of human behavior that make us more than reactive and self-protective. The qualities of courage, intelligence, and generous foresight, self-critical awareness and concern for balanced universal welfare, which, under other names, have been part of the vocabulary of European ethics for 2,500 years. Fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. In the Christian world, of course, they have been supplemented by and grounded in the virtues of faith, hope, and charity that in their full meaning are bound up with relation to God. In this context, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Robert Keane of St. Edmund's College, University of Cambridge. Mr. Keane was wasn't invited here for his strong friendship with me. Following a career in business management, he has taught and written extensively on corporate affairs and finance business ethics for both economic and mid-career education and training. His primary area of research interest is in the potential social, virtue-based ethics to inform and add value to corporate strategies, with particular reference to the role and function of trust as a core determinant in the stakeholders' relationship. Mr. Keane is also the chair of the Catholic Union's Education Working Committee, which works closely with British Catholic MPs, and he is a member of the International Thomas More Society. As you know, the topic of today's lecture is Banking on Virtue. And now, Mr. Keane, I leave the word to you. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. First, an enormous thank you to Father here for inviting me over. It's a great honour. And no less a privilege that you've decided to come to listen to me this evening rather than do at least one of half a dozen interesting things. So thank you for that. This is my first visit to Malta, and on reflection, I'm rather ashamed of that and must promise to come again soon. Amazed by your history, your culture, and above all, dare I say, by you. And also, dare I say, as an Englishman, by your weather, for which thank you very much. Lest I go on too long, and I'll try not to, you, I hope, will remind me of the speaker at an important after-dinner event who went on and on and on until everybody got extremely bored. And in desperation, another guest picked up a bottle and hurled it at the speaker. It missed, but it hit the host on the forehead, rendering him unconscious. But as he came round, he was heard to say, "Hit me again, I can still hear his voice." The Holy Father's most recent encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, which I hope some of you by now have had an opportunity to read and digest. It reminds us that the Church has always held that an economic action is not of itself opposed to social improvement. It's not this instrument that must be called to account, but the individuals and their moral consciences and their personal and social responsibility. Not surprisingly, Pope Benedict's comment is firmly embedded in the timelessly relevant commentaries of Scripture. I think we all remember, perhaps, that God doesn't always condemn people for making money. As early as Genesis, Isaac sowed in the land and reaped 100-fold in the same year. Lucky chap. And the Lord blessed him, and he became rich and ultimately wealthy. On the other hand, however, of the 60 or more comments on wealth in the Old Testament, the greatest majority by far are of a very different order. Shall we all remember Elijah's condemnation of King Ahab, that ghastly wife, Jezebel, who plotting to murder Naboth to obtain his vineyard. And anybody who can read Amos without shaking, as it were, is a very brave man, because his is the most impassioned denunciation of anybody who swindles or exploits others or oppresses the poor. And this theme follows faithfully through the New Testament, above all, perhaps, with that most powerful of Jesus' injunctions that it's impossible to serve two masters. And the one we all remember, you cannot serve God and mammon. And in the parables of the wicked tenants and the use of talents, Jesus both reconfirms and amplifies the older prophetic conditions concerning social justice, but specifically in a financial context. The Church has been faithful to this teaching. From Rerum Novarum on, the encyclical written in the late or early 1890s, the Church has published a succession of such encyclicals and addresses and homilies, all recalling scriptural teaching on money to mind. So we can't say we haven't been warned. And interestingly, it was the late Pope John Paul II made no less than 300 addresses, virtually everywhere around the world, to private sector communities, all on or related to diverse aspects of financial ethics. And those homilies of his are all now published and widely available, and I can strongly recommend them. They're very accessible, typical of the man. And what the Vatican was doing, so the bishops' conferences were also pursuing, notably in the States and the UK. The UK commentary on the common good, as our Catholic social teaching recognises the positive value of business and free human dignity in the economic sector. And the ownership of wealth is a right the Church protects. But equally, we explicitly reject belief in the automatic beneficence of market forces, which must embody ethical principles. And this in turn has been picked up by Catholic academia in many countries around the world, and by no means least here in Malta, with interpretive teaching. Huge literature on this subject. And equally, the laity has become increasingly involved. In the UK, Christian associations abound, working actively to try to encourage business management in particular to accept spiritual as well as material values in their decision processes. And then there have been books, all a good read, incidentally. Liar's Poker, Barbarians at the Gate, All That Glitters, but all reflecting society's conviction that banking is anything but human, unwilling to compromise an organization's survival, clinging to its financial obligations, and yet nothing without humans that comprise its workforce, its customers, its shareholders, suppliers, and other constituents. And it is this that the Holy Father, in Caritas in Veritate, precisely reflects. He says, every phase of an economic cycle has a moral consequence. He goes on, the economy needs a people-centred ethics if it is to function correctly. And third, that the primary capital to be safeguarded is not money. The primary capital to be safeguarded is man, the human person, and his or her integrity. The Holy Father goes on to